Hello everyone and welcome to this quick little video about how to create models for the game. I'm just going to be showing you how the models need to be created and exported, and then I'll show you how to use the model converter tool. So I'm using Blender here, but you can use whatever 3D modeling software you want. Just make sure to do the equivalent of what I show in this video. So when you're making models, obviously the lower the number of triangles you use, the better. I'm not going for a particularly detailed or realistic art style, so you can keep the models fairly simple. Especially when you're modelling something round or spherical, you can often just let the smooth shading do all of the work for you. For weapons and armour, you should probably aim for no more than a few hundred triangles. I think most of the weapons in the game at the moment are around 200 or 300 triangles. They really don't need to be very high poly because they're usually rendered pretty small on the screen, so it's not really noticeable. For entities, it really depends how big the entity is going to be, but use as few triangles as possible without it looking too obviously low poly. Think World of Warcraft models, pretty simple low poly meshes, and it's the texture that does most of the work. As for texturing, all of the textures need to be square and the width and height have to be powers of 2. Obviously the smaller the texture is the better, but use your own judgment when deciding how big they should be. Small objects like weapons should definitely not need textures bigger than 512 by 512 pixels, and usually 256 by 256 is perfectly sufficient. Also, don't use materials at all. Material data isn't used by my parser, so put everything into the texture. Things like shine and reflectivity can be set in the DevTools. One final thing, before you export your model, you need to make sure that the shading on the whole model is set to smooth. Don't use the flat shading at all, because my parser doesn't read this information. If you want to make some edges hard, then use the edge split command, as it has the exact same effect. When exporting the model, export to the OBJ file format and make sure that you have these settings here selected, otherwise it won't work. So, once you've got your OBJ file, you need to go into the DevKit folder, go into the repository and put it in the OBJ files folder, and then you can run the model converter tool. To open up a new OBJ file, you need to click File and then New Model File, and then you can choose the model from the list here. If the model was properly exported, then it'll appear here in this preview window. So you've got some information about the model here, most importantly the triangle count, and then you can scale the model up or down using this slider. If your model is part of a piece of armor or a weapon, then do not use the scale slider at all. Completely ignore the scale and don't worry that it looks a bit bigger than it should in comparison to the player here. If you modelled it correctly onto the player model like I explained in the items video, then it will be scaled correctly when it's in the game. If your model is used for an entity, then you can use the scale slider to make the entity roughly the right size that it should be in comparison to the player. Don't worry about being too accurate here, because you can always scale the entities again when they're added to the world in the world editor. Then over here you've got some options for the preview, all of which are pretty much self-explanatory. The texture options here are just for the preview, by the way, so you don't have to set the texture here and it doesn't get saved if you do. It's just for if you wanted to see how the model looks with its texture on. As for the level of detail stuff, you probably don't need to worry about it. If your model is less than like 1,000 triangles, then it's probably not worth doing anyway. So then you just need to save the model in the file format that my game needs it to be in, and for that you just have to click Save. The file is saved into the Models folder in the repository, which is where it needs to be used for creating entities or items, so you can just leave it there. And that is pretty much everything you need to know if you're wanting to help make models for the game. So thanks a lot for watching this video, and I am very much looking forward to seeing what you guys can create.